so excited, everybody, to have someone who I have considered to be one of my teachers in my yoga past here today, Fiona Stang. Fiona draws from over 27 years. Actually, it might be more than that, depending on when that bio was written. How many
Yeah,
years have you been?
I started yoga in 1995. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
I can't do math.
in a while. Well, we're all
It's been a while.
yeah,
And
30
she is 30 years. Yeah. Like, wow.
Where
Anyways,
did time go?
I agree. And her passion in teaching is making yoga a practice for life, which I definitely experienced as your student. With her attention focused on healing the body, mind, and soul. And Fiona first went to Mysore, India in 1999 to study with the Jois family and Pattabhi Jois. And in 2000, she was authorized to, that was pretty quick. You went in 99, and then in 2000, you were authorized to teach Ashtanga Yoga. And she founded a Mysore program in Vancouver, which is where I had the good fortune to meet her. And in July 2009, she was one of the first group of 40 students worldwide to receive a level 2 authorization from the Krishna Pattabhi Jois Ashtanga Yoga Institute. It's amazing. And I'm so excited to have her here today. One, to just catch up with her, and also to share a little bit about this wonderful, wonderful style and lineage and to help us learn a little bit more about it. So
Thank
thank
you
you.
for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear. Well, can we just start by learning maybe a little bit about you? So, you've been practicing yoga for 30 years. Could you just tell a little bit about how you got into yoga and where the journey took you?
Yeah, absolutely. I was probably around 10 or 12, and my mom's a travel agent, so she was always traveling. She loves travel, still travels to this day at 83. Anyways, she just came home from India, and I'll never forget, she opened her suitcase and the smell, a mixture of like incense, jasmine, I don't know, it's just India. And I just was like, I need to go there. And for some reason, I was just like, I'm going to learn yoga. I don't know why. All I knew about yoga at that time, and you have to remember there was no Lululemon back then. Yoga was not people carrying yoga mats around how they do in Vancouver or anywhere in the world. You see it everywhere. That was not happening. But I just was fascinated. I knew about yoga was pretzel postures and her suitcase. And I'm like, I want to do that. Fast forward, gosh, maybe 1995. Well, yeah, 1995. That's when I started yoga. My sister was getting married, and I think, she was probably a little bit nervous. So she's like, let's do some yoga. And she had graduated for university and had been first learned yoga in university and had been teaching it a little bit as well. So she was my first yoga teacher. And as a kid, I had allergies. I think I spent my whole childhood breathing through my mouth, not knowing that wasn't normal. Um,
Mm.
just really bad allergies and colds, asthma, you name it. But she taught me how to belly breathe. She alerted me to the fact that I breathe through my mouth constantly. And that was the beginning. She taught me some Shivananda yoga and handed me a little book. I think she probably mailed it to me later. And I have this little teeny little Shivananda book. And I had done a lot of sports and I was so tight. And I remember looking at these postures in the book thinking, this is just ridiculous. But I was pretty type A and I was working in Wall Street at the time.
Oh, wow.
Oh yeah. And I did my yoga every day. Um,
Mm.
so out of a book, here I was in New York, which at the time was kind of a mecca for yoga. It was starting to get really bigger, I should say, after not no one really doing yoga. And
Yeah.
I was doing it in a book. But yes,
What year? What years are we in here?
like 1995-ish to nine. Oh no, when did I graduate university? Gosh. Yeah, 1995.
I was in New York at that same time, Fiona. That's
There we
crazy.
go. Were you going to yoga classes?
I was. Well, not till 98. That's when I started going to yoga classes. Yeah.
That's probably when it kind of became. So there you go. We were in the same place. I would do my yoga. I would rollerblade around Central Park. I would
Me too.
anything, but I knew I wasn't really happy in Wall Street. So my
Mm.
husband was getting transferred to Indonesia. I thought, perfect. I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to come to Indonesia and do Balinese dance. This was just, but my company ended up transferring me. So I went on to Indonesia, worked there, and long story short, at the end of it, I did a little sabbatical in Bali at a holistic health center. I learned another style of yoga, and to this day, I don't know what it was called. Supposedly, it was Japanese. I'm not sure where the Japanese and the yoga connection, I don't even know what it was, but someone showed it to me. I did it religiously, and I liked it because it was intense. Fast forward a little more, my yoga it keeps going. I eventually quit my job in Wall Street. I'm back in New York, and I moved to the Omega Institute, which is a holistic health center.
Yeah, I
In
do. Yeah.
there you go, upstate New York, a couple hours from the city. And I moved from concrete apartment building to living in a tent. And I'm working in exchange for room and board. I'm working in the garden. And I also have access to lots of meditation and yoga classes. So every morning I would join this Buddhist monk and I'd sit in this beautiful meditation hall and try to not think. And
It's hard.
it was hard. It was
Yeah.
even hard. It was just useless. I ended up like, I like to sew. So I'd be like thinking of things I was going to sew in my head. I was thinking 100% of the time and trying not to think. Um,
Mm.
I was super type A. I was super go get 'em. So that was that component. I showed up every day though. I kept trying. I met a woman who did Iyengar yoga. So I'm like, can I follow your practice? So I would just do what she did. I did some Kali Ray. I did Bikram. I tried, or a heated class. And at the end of the summer in the fall, there was a 200-hour teacher training. So my first teachers, they called it interdisciplinary, Dawn and Amba Camp Stapleton, a long time ago. It was Iyengar, Kripalu, which is a style from back east,
Mm.
and Ashtanga. But it really was more power yoga. It wasn't traditional Ashtanga. I didn't know that at the time, but that's fine. Of course, I fell in love with the power flow. I liked the flowing movements with breath, mainly because it helped my mind step back. Again, I was a type A thinker. Fast forward
Mm.
after that, I'm a quote unquote teacher. It's 1997, and we moved to Vancouver in 1998, and I start teaching. And I had signs up, no one knew about yoga back then, as I mentioned. And I taught out of Body and Soul, which is like a little private gym. And I taught out of Ron Zelko, which is a big gym in Vancouver,
Yeah.
not of a yoga space. And I would do demos. I was trying to get people. Ron was great. He gave me the space for free. I probably started with 2 clients. But I was passionate and I was going to make this happen. Um,
Mm.
and that was sort of where, if most people know about Lululemon, that was kind of the whole, well, a couple years into it was the whole Lululemon era, where Chip Wilson
Yeah.
came to one of my classes and he's like, "What do you wear for yoga?" And this is how Lululemon was born from this whole era. And
Yeah.
fast forward to today, and you walk down the street, and everyone's carrying yoga mats. But I met 2 people. They saw my signs at Granville Island advertising power yoga, and they said, "Come practice with us." So they were teaching out of the Vancouver General Hospital. It used to have a wellness center. It's long gone. But here I was. I showed up, and they wheeled in on one of those the TVs in the old days were those big boxes, super heavy, and they had a media cart, and they rolled in the media cart into this huge gymnasium. There was 3 of us, popped in a VHS tape. I'm really outdating myself now. And I met David Swenson, not in person, but I
Oh,
knew him in person. And I did my first Ashtanga class, the primary series with David Swenson and these 2 people I just met. And I was laying in rest at the end on my back, and I thought, this is it. And ever since
mm.
then, I think that was 1998 sometime, I've been practicing Ashtanga yoga.
Oh, wow. That was such a good. I'm so excited about these details I just learned about your life.
It continues a little bit because there was only one book at the time. Pattabhi Jois's book, Yoga Mala, was written, but it was written in Canada. That didn't get published, I think, till I think it was 1999. I think it was my first trip to Mysore. So there wasn't a lot of books at all. I mean, David Swenson had his VHS tapes, thankfully. I believe Richard Freeman had, I think, maybe a VHS.
Yeah.
And Carol Bender Birch had a book called Power Yoga. And basically, it was the entire primary series, maybe missing one or two poses, or maybe a few poses. I think it was definitely missing Janu C. But, anyways,
Yeah.
somewhere in the book, she mentions, I believe, again, this is a long time ago, but pretty much, I think it came from her book. I saw the word Mysore, India, and I saw the name Pattabhi Jois. And I said, that's where I'm going. I got to get to the source of this. So within a year, 1999, that's where I went.
And that was your first trip to India? It finally happened?
99 was my first trip to India. I just knew about the primary series. I had no teachers in the flesh other than my two practice buddies who came with me, who had introduced me to Ashtanga. I felt like I knew David Swenson because I had his voice, playing in front of me so many times. So
Yeah.
yeah, I went to India and yeah, that's
What was that like? What did you expect and then what happened?
India it's a lot different than Mysore is now. It was not a yoga mecca back then at all. And there was no internet, or if there was, it
Yeah.
wasn't really being used, right? There were no cell phones. So when you showed up, I, I don't even know how we did it, but we went to the police station and we're like, we're trying to find this teacher, yoga master, Pattabhi Jois, and his grandson, Sharath. And they're like, oh, just go that way, go down there. It's this little alleyway. And I think there was a sign. There was a sign eventually, and I'm pretty sure there was one, but it's a side door. And anyways, you go and register. And I was a little nervous. I mean, I had heard he was pretty fierce. I didn't know much. And there's 12 people in the room, 10 or 12.
Oh.
I think it's 12. Two rows of five, I believe, and two rows facing in. The room's teeny. And there's Sharat and who's his grandson, and Pattabhi Jois, both teaching. So nothing is missed. Like they see everything. There's no hiding. There's no, you know. So
Oh, this might be a good time to just explain to people because folks might not know. They think a yoga class, they think it's led. So maybe to explain what a Mysore practice is.
yeah. So Mysore is the place in India where you go to study if you were interested in the Ashtanga lineage, pretty much. It's the source. And we call it Mysore style, and it's just the way it's been named, I guess. And it's pretty much how it's taught. Now, Ashtanga yoga is taught individually to each person one-on-one. So if you were to show up to my studio, we're open for 3 hours in the morning. Um, Unlike a class where the teacher stands in the front and leads everyone through the same sequence at the same time, like a lead class, we do that once a week. But the other days of the week, it's called Mysore style. And everyone shows up, they have an assigned start time approximately. They show up and they do their own practice at their own pace. And this creates a very individualized approach. So if I have someone who's a triathlete, or like my daughter, a ski racer at a really high level, versus someone who's 80 years old, versus someone who's 50, versus a woman who's going through hormonal changes at 50, whatever. Anyways, I can basically work with the person and modify it for them as they need or make the practice their own. So it's very much individually oriented. So yeah, that's the majority of the teaching. And then once a week, we come together for the lead class, which is where we flow as one body, one breath. Everyone moves together in sequence, but it's not a teaching class. All the teaching is one-on-one. So that by the time you come to the lead class, I almost consider it more advanced. You're like, oh, I know all these postures. And you only do the postures you've been taught in the lead class. Does that
Right.
make
I think that I think this is something that's really important to explain to people because people think Ashtanga, because they don't know, right? That most folks, I would
sense?
imagine, haven't been to a Mysore style experience. And so they don't realize like how individualized you make the practice for people or how individualized it is. They just think sequence. So could you tell us a little bit about the series? Because that's also a component of it.
Yeah, so it is like Bikram, it is a set series. And in
It's not
Ashtanga,
like Bikram.
like they're set order, like set poses.
Yeah.
But yes, it's very different. But um, so there's the primary, there's the intermediate, and then there's the advanced series, which are about three separate series. The primary series is called Yoga Chikitsa. It means yoga therapy. It has a lot of forward bending. It has a lot of where we sit in half lotus. and put the heel, when you're sitting in half lotus, there's pressure against your navel, and then we're folding forward on that. So we're generating with this forward folding motion a lot of internal cleansing. Then in Ashtanga, and I haven't talked about this yet, the main precept of Ashtanga is the breath. And the breath is an audible breath. We call it free breathing with sound. Some people call it ujjayi, but usually my teacher would just shout out free breathing. It's audible. It heats the body internally. So as you're breathing and folding forward with your heel and your navel, you're creating a lot of internal cleansing. So that's where the therapy is in the first series of Ashtanga. The second series is called Nadi Shodhana. It has a lot more back bending and more greater flexibility and strength. And that's really called nervous system cleansing. It has a lot to do with the spinal column and, cleansing out the nervous system. So it's yet another different level. And then the third series is really about strength and grace. It's about that culmination of both series. The primary series is so important, though. It's really the foundation. And then from there,
Mm.
again, you don't have to do all series at all. And they're very hard. I only got into the very beginning of the advanced A series. So it's a path. It's a journey, and it moves beyond postures. But most important is your primary series. I think the very beginning of second, those are great. If you can get through that, you have a really good solid practice.
Yeah. So let's talk about a little because you've mentioned this is so there's conceptions out there which I'd also like to,
Yes.
well, they like, oh, Ashtanga's so intense, so it's
I know.
impossible.
I
So
know.
what do you think?
Yes. And you know what? I'm so glad you said it because I love Ashtanga, obviously. When I first was lying there in rest that day, I thought, this is it. And, Sharath would say, anyone can do Ashtanga yoga except if you're lazy. What Ashtanga does demand is it does ask you to show up, and you do need to show
Oh.
up daily and do your practice. So that's hard. Like it does require a great deal of commitment. But going to an Ashtanga class that's a led class as your first class is not a normal experience of Ashtanga. It's not how it's actually taught. So when I get a new student and they're like, I'll just come to the led class, I'm like, actually, that's our most advanced class, so you can't. Um, it's supposed to be taught one-on-one. So, anything can be modified. I remember once in 2009, they had the first official Ashtanga teacher training ever. We can talk about teacher training later, but at any rate, it was Sharath and 40 students approximately. Pattabhi Jois was supposed to be there, but he had just passed away. But early on in the training, someone said to Sharath, what if someone can't stand? What are you going to do? And he looked at them. He's like, well, then start them on the floor. So anyone can do Ashtanga. If they can't stand, I'll start them on the floor. If they're in a cast, I'll figure it out. I've worked with broken arms, broken legs. I've worked with someone who can't forward fold, and I just mentioned the whole primary series is forward folding. I've worked with people with back injuries. We'll make it work. And the neat thing is, if you keep working day in, day out at whatever level you can mindfully, the forms will eventually take place. They come and they go. Sometimes you can do it, sometimes
Mm.
you can't, but the forms will take place. But Ashtanga is individual. It's not supposed to be taught all the time in a group setting, in terms of a led class setting. I mean, it should be one-on-one.
Yeah. I think that's so huge for folks to hear. It was interesting. I was just talking to Leslie Kaminoff about kind of, from the Desikachar line of
Mhm.
yoga and how therapeutic it is and how it's one-on-one. And folks may not know. Well, Ashtanga also one-on-one. Like, oh,
And it's the same lineage, really. I mean, Krishnamacharya was Pattabhi Jois's teacher. He talked reverently about him. And, Desikachar also learned from his father, Krishnamacharya. And it was all one-on-one. I had a good fortune of taking a class with Maggie Ray, who's in a study with Desikachar or Mohan. I'm not sure now, but that lineage at any rate. And it was different, but what wasn't different was the breath. It was a very
yes.
focus. And I remember just feeling like I'm coming home. There's a very strong correlation in Ashtanga, at least with whatever style she was teaching, of whether it was Desikachar or Mohan, I think his name is, with the breath.
Yeah, I've had that experience too. I had the fortune to take a workshop. This is years ago, like at some yoga journal conference, right? With Desikachar and
Oh,
like
okay.
and how yeah and how breath focused that was. And then in Ashtanga, and I remember when I came back because I was in the Ashtanga practice for a while, and then I left, and then I came back, and you asked me, you said, "Why'd you come back?" And I it was like the break. It was for the breath. It was because of the internal experience of the practice, which was so powerful and beautiful. And I kind of miss that. Like it got like certain forms of yoga can feel very externally driven, and Ashtanga felt like it was coming from the inside of your body out from the breathing. So
I
it's
think that.
beautiful.
I mean, I think my first memory of when I walked in the practice room in Mysore, India for the first time, 12 people, two teachers, all I could hear was the breath. And honestly, for me, I mentioned, I was it was hard to sit still and meditate. My mind had, as Pattabhi Jois would say, too many monkeys in the mind. When people would ask him about meditation, he would always say, "There's too many monkeys in your mind. You can't sit still." Um, and that was me, 100%. But when I started doing Ashtanga and linking the breath with the movement, and basically the whole practice is a breath focus, breath, 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 breath. When I did that, my mind stepped back, the thoughts stepped back. And I think it was 10 years into my practice, it took a while. Um, I could sit and I could finally just sit and not be thinking about
Mm.
what I was making for dinner, what I was going to sew in my sewing machine, or whatever. I could finally, and just doing the practice, um, just gave me that stillness that I've been kind of waiting for my entire life. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's I think we talked about this. I can't remember if this was when John Scott was at the Shala. So I can't remember quite what it was, but talking about the eight limbs of yoga is actually happening all at the same time in the Ashtanga practice. So it's like
Yeah,
you get the pranayama and there's asana, of course, but there's also the pranayama and the meditation that happens as you're doing it. So it's not separated, but it's
good
part of
memory.
it.
Good memory. Yeah.
Stuck with me.
That would be one of the, I remember Pattabhi Jois and Sharath would say, you start with asana. So Ashtanga means eight limbs. Do I need to get into the eight limbs or do we kind of know
But
that?
yeah, give people a brief breather and then they can go watch videos on the eight limbs. But yeah.
I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert, but okay, Ashtanga means eight limbs. So there's eight limbs, and the third limb is asana. And Pattabhi Jois, Shara, they'd always say that asana is the starting point. And what it was thought is that you start with the physical body. You start with something that you know really well, our body. We can touch it, it's tangible. And from there, all the other limbs will appear, kind of like you just said. So pranayama is the fourth limb, and that's breathing. Well, in Ashtanga, we're using this breathing technique, as I mentioned, the free breathing, with what we call mula bandha, which is kind of a way just to engage the core, if I can give it a really not such a great example, but we'll talk more about that. So we use that. So that's one of the limbs. The other limbs, the yamas and the niyamas, I kind of think of them as like the sort of like the Ten Commandments. It's really about being a good person. Gandhi used to talk about ahimsa, nonviolence, satya,
Mm.
truth, asteya, not stealing. What else?
Parigraha.
Parigraha, not being possessive, not hoarding. And then the niyamas are observances, they're more outer, but sosha being clean, santosha being content. Tapas, I think of like turning up the heat or discipline, showing up regularly on your mat, in life, whatever. Swadhyaya is self-study, and Pranadhana is kind of a higher surrender to our higher source. So that's the first and second limb. Asana is the third limb. We talked about that. The fourth limb is pranayama. And then the fifth limb, pratyahara, is kind of withdrawing the senses. The sixth limb, dharana, is concentration. And then when you can really concentrate for a sustained period, you get into meditation, dhyana, samadhi, the last limb, bliss. So how this works is you do your practice every day. You show up, you show up, you show up. And you're getting up early to practice. in Mysore, it's really early, but maybe not so early, but maybe even 6 a.m. So, you're going to choose not to go to bed too late the night before. And maybe you're not going to eat dinner at 8 o'clock and you're not going to eat really
Mm,
rich food because then when you're folding forward, you feel it. So we start to become aware of our life choices. We start to take care of our inner body, and then we also hopefully project that to the outer world. And how can we take care of our environment, and what kind of diet is least harmful for our planet? um, we just become more mindful, and that's when the other
mm,
limbs start to unfold. Maybe we do
mm,
some studying of yoga principles. It all comes from there. I remember one of my trips to India. It was my friend's first trip, and he's a great yoga teacher now, but it was his first trip. And, it's a lot going to Mysore for the first time, especially back then. There was, you know, it was complicated. So he was focusing on his practice. And I said to him one day, I said, "Do you want to come to chanting? We're going to do some chanting." And he's like, "Oh, no, I'm not into that." I'm like, "Okay, totally fine." 2 years later, fast forward, he's chanting. He knows more Sanskrit than me. He has a total pranayama practice. It was almost like he started with the asana and all of the other limbs unfolded from there. So all the other doors kind of opened. And
mm.
so the starting point is asana. The other limbs become apparent from that point. That's kind of the idea in Ashtanga.
I mean, yeah, one of Pattabhi Jois, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of his most famous statements was practice and all is coming.
Yeah,
It's like, just do
absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
Do
And
it.
And people would always want to analyze, well, why can't I do this? And his answer was always breathing incorrect or mula bandha incorrect. And my first couple trips to Mysore, I'm like, that's it. I'm like, aren't you going to give me the anatomy? Aren't you going to give me the and sometimes he would not really talk about anatomy, but philosophy. But I started to learn. I was like, he's right. You just show up and practice, and the answers reveal themselves. Um, I remember one trip to India, sometimes I would think of questions in my head that I'd want to ask. And sometimes they would be answered without me asking. I don't think I ever asked them. But what I started to learn is they did become they were answered. I remember when I went to New York to study with him, and it was 9/11, the year of 9/11. And it was a really awful time to be in New York. It was really sad. It was, unfortunate. Few days after 9/11, and everyone's struggling to keep it together. We were bringing food to the firemen halls. Of course, there were no firemen. A lot of them had been killed in the whole events that happened. But we met a few days later, and I got off the subway in Soho because we were meeting at Eddie Stern's studio, small studio.
Mm,
And we got inside, and I'm thinking, why are we doing this? Like, it still smells like smoke outside. The air is totally crazy bad, and there's police everywhere. Like, we had to go through, area different like police to get into even the area. Anyways, long
mm,
story short, we start practicing, and we're sitting. He led us through a really brisk, fast practice. Nothing hard. I mean, it's challenging, but he didn't hold anything hard. He was just moving energy, brisk. And sometimes he would say, briskly, you take. Fast practice. We're sitting in meditation at the end. And then I was like, this is why I practice. For moments like these, when you don't even recognize that you're holding so much stress, and I could just feel, no, the situation in the external world was not better, but the situation in my internal world
mm,
was vastly more calm.
mm,
And that kind of answered my question, why do we practice yoga? For moments like
mm.
these, when we're completely off our midline, the practice has a way of
Yep.
bringing us back to our center. And I could just feel tears streaming down my face. It was a hard time. And a lot of the people in the room were teachers in New York, and, they had to go teach their students. So he held us together during that and just reminded us, like, this is why we practice for hard moments
Yeah.
in life. So,
Yeah. Mm. So, oh, there's so many places to go. Okay, I'm going to try to like keep myself streamlined. In terms of the practice, one of the things that I think is so important for folks to know is how influential Ashtanga is, even if you've never taken a quote unquote Ashtanga class. Like the influence of Pattabhi Jois and the influence of the Ashtanga lineage is incalculable. It just is. It's interwoven into people's understanding of power yoga, flow yoga, vinyasa yoga. Like the sun salutations, that's from Ashtanga, everybody. Everyone. So I just wanted to highlight, I think we've highlighted some of the things like the breath, like if you're in a breath focused practice, if you're in a flow, if you're doing something like vinyasa, that we're like, that's the lineage that we're all coming from.
Yeah.
Um, Another one that came up to me, I was just thinking is drishti. Could you talk about how that plays into the practice?
Absolutely. So, and I probably might even, I think I'll talk about Tristana. So, what makes Ashtanga very unique, at least from my perspective, is Tristana. So, there's three components. The breath, I've talked a bit about, that's one component. Another component is Mula Bandha, and the third component is Drishti. So, all three of these components are really the essence of the practice. And for me, when I think of an advanced practice, I don't necessarily think of someone doing incredible pretzel poses, although that can be quite advanced. But to me, it's, do they have the components of Tristana? So breath, I've talked a bit about, and I talked about my first experience in Mysore when you walked in and all you heard was the breath. And that is one thing that makes a Mysore room really unique. When you walk in, you won't hear a lot of talking. You'll hear a lot of breathing. The teacher will kind of have subtle commands here and there, and the teacher will be roaming the room, working individually with all the students. The breath is the sound that takes over. So from a teaching perspective, if I'm helping someone and they're not breathing, we're going right
Mm.
back to breath because it's not, I don't want to be helping them until they get their breath is really steady, rhythmic, and even. So that becomes the focus. Supporting the breath, we have Mula Bandha. And Mula Bandha basically means root lock. You can think of it as a lifting up of the pelvic floor. Um, and some people would say an engagement of the anus, but really the pelvic floor drawing upward and creating strength in your lower core so that when you're flowing with your breath, especially doing dynamic movements like sun salutations, you have a support for your core, kind of a tether.
Mm.
So that's Mula Bandha. They take an enormous amount of focus. Just to focus on your breath and
Yeah.
you're engaging Mula Bandha. There's even a whole book called Mula Bandha, the Master Key. And it says it takes 10 years to even get a glimpse of Mula Bandha. So Mula Bandha is hard. The breath is hard. And then the third component is like taking it to an even deeper level, and that's drishti. And drishti is a gazing point. So we have this flowing practice, and as we do every pose, we have a drishti. So when I inhale, I look thumbs. When I exhale, I look nose tip. And this goes on and on. In Trikonasana, my gaze is the hand. In some poses, it's the nose tip. It could be the third eye. It could be the navel. It could be if you're
Mm.
twisting, looking right, looking left. What is all this about? Well, it's for people like me whose mind is constantly moving and it needs to be directed. And so, what the practice, the breath, the bandha, the drishti gives you is you're practicing suddenly in your own little bubble. And you may not even know what the person next to you is doing in the Mysore room. That to me is a good practice.
Yeah.
When I'm in my breath, in my experience, I'm not going to hit anyone because I'm on my mat and I'm aware of people, but I'm in it. And that is all
Mm.
about kind of withdrawing the senses, going inside, part of these eight limbs, going into that still place. Is
Mm.
that good?
Yeah, that's wonderful. So actually, so Krishnamacharya, we touched on him. He's like I think of Krishnamacharya as kind of like the granddaddy of so much,
Yeah,
right?
good.
Do you know the story of how the Ashtanga practice came to Pattabhi Jois through Krishnamacharya? Do you know? I don't know that story very well. Do you happen to know it?
Yeah, and there's lots of also who knows about the story. There's a lot of questions. You mean how Krishnamacharya learned Ashtanga?
Yeah, sure. I didn't even, yeah. I thought that I heard something about scrolls. I don't know. Like, I'm
There
not
was
sure what it
an
is.
ancient text, which no one's seen except for maybe Krishnamacharya, called the Yoga Karunta. Is this true or not? I have no idea because I haven't seen it. But at any rate, Krishnamacharya studied in the Himalayas for, I believe it was 7 years with his teacher Rama Mohan. brahmachari and learned this form, which I then believe Pattabhi Jois called it Ashtanga because he believed it was the eight limbs. I could be wrong here, but and so Krishnamacharya passed it down to Pattabhi Jois, and it's been passed on and on kind of from there. Um, what can I tell you? Pattabhi Jois himself is kind of interesting. He's born in this small village, which I visited one trip. I met it. I was at his family home. It was neat. I met his
Wow.
yeah, met part of his family. Anyways, it's called Kaushika. He was born on the full moon in July, which is also called Guru Purnima, which is the day of the guru or the teacher. And the Joyce family were astrologers. And
Oh, I didn't know that.
supposedly, yeah, and this is an interesting little tidbit, but normally, I don't know if it's still true now, but you would do what your family did. So Pattabhi Jois probably should have been an astrologer. And
Right.
it's interesting because there is a lot of astrology in Ashtanga. And I'm guessing that didn't come from Krishnamacharya. I'm guessing that more came from Pattabhi, because with anything we do, just like when I teach Ashtanga, I put my own slant on it, right?
Yeah.
Someone else teaches it. Yes, it's a set series, but we all have our own perspective. So,
Mm,
so for example, we take full and new moons off in Ashtanga. We don't practice. Today was a moon day. We don't practice on moon days. In the old days, we used to take Saturday off. I think that was because it was Saturday, and I think it was considered less auspicious. Then when Sharath
mm,
started teaching, he had a family. I think there were, everyone has to make it work for their schedules, and
yeah.
they switched the days off. No big deal. But they would never give you new poses on Tuesdays because it was the god of war, I believe. Sharath and Pattabhi Jois would show up to the Shala on Tuesday, not shaving. They wouldn't travel on Tuesdays. Definitely don't shave on Tuesdays. Don't get a haircut on Tuesdays. Don't do new endeavors on Tuesdays. No new postures on Tuesdays. Generally, postures were not given before the moon days, but the day after the moon day was very auspicious for postures. So all of that's astrology.
Mm,
And I'm guessing that came from his side. When Pattabhi Jois was 12, he met Krishnamacharya, who came to do a lecture and a demonstration. And that was it. He basically went to Krishnamacharya and became a student the next day.
mm,
He ran away from home a few years later when he was 15 to study
mm,
Sanskrit, and he became a Sanskrit scholar, Pattabhi Jois. And pretty much 2 years when he ran away to Mysore, where there was a Sanskrit university. And 2 years into his stay in Mysore, approximately, he met Krishnamacharya, came back. And I think he spent the next 20 or 25 years studying with Krishnamacharya. Um, Krishnamacharya was given um, the Jagamohan Palace, which was near the Mysore Palace, as a practice yoga center, because supposedly he had cured the Maharaja of Mysore um,
mm,
from a very bad illness, and no one else could cure him. And it was yoga that cured him. So
mm.
um, Pattabhi Jois, worked with Krishnamacharya for a long time and eventually made a little shala in his house. And I believe the first Westerners started coming in the mid 60s, maybe. Um,
Mm.
and I think that was also when he put the teeny shala in the back of his house, which, as I mentioned, I think there was 12 of us in the room. Small little room.
Oh, I had no idea it was so intimate at that
Oh,
time.
yeah. And
Like,
then in 2000, oh, when was it? Maybe 2002. I'm trying to think. Probably 2002. They moved to a different part of town. The first shala was in Lakshmipuram. That was at teeny shala. And then they moved to Gokulam, um, to a larger shala, which I don't know, maybe fit 50. And Saraswati teaches there to this day. And then
oh,
Sharath moved to an even bigger shala, which houses, I don't know, probably hundreds. It's huge.
oh,
Just
wow.
a little bit further out. Yeah.
I love, Fiona, that you were there like at the teeny shala. Like that, I mean, this is just and met Pattabhi Jois and he was your teacher. I mean, that's just legendary that to have that experience. Um, yeah, is there anything that you want to share about your experience with Pattabhi Jois? I mean, he's like a living legend in my world. So
Yeah.
anything you wanted to
You know, within my first week of practice, I remember I was doing backbending with him, and I hadn't had a teacher in the physical form of Ashtanga yet. So he was my first Ashtanga teacher. I mean, I had David Swenson, thankfully. He's an amazing teacher, still teaching to this day. But I hadn't met, I don't think, David Swenson at that time. This is 1999. Yeah, I think Pattabhi Jois is my
Mm.
first in the body teacher. But within that first week, he shouted out at me. I was doing back bends and he wanted me to catch my ankles. And I'm like, what is he talking about? And I panicked and I came up. I was, in a back bend. And he shouted at me, why fearing? And I'm like, oh my gosh, really? Is it that obvious? I had a lot of fear growing up. I had a lot of fear as a child. One of my friends used to be like, you're so paranoid. And I was. And that was such a pivotal moment for me because he was pushing my buttons, but done with love. But
Mm.
he saw what was going on. And yoga became a way for me to work through fear. Um, and face fear in my life. And it's not to say I don't have fear now. I do, but I can now see the fear is over here. I'm not the fear.
Mm.
I learned so much from that. And that's pretty much why I kept going back. He really addressed you as an individual. And
Mm.
same thing for like Sharath was the same. This whole idea of, Ashtanga being only for fit people or only for flexible people. When Julian showed up in Mysore, I thought, oh God, Julian's my husband, sorry. So he was really stiff, super active, hiker, biker, skier, always in nature. And he was the stiffest person I've ever worked with. And stiff in terms of his hips, okay? And
Yeah.
so he shows up, Sharath's away, out of town just for like a week. And I'm like, and when you showed up, you went to the end of the line. So there's only 12 people in the room. There's a line that goes up a stairwell, which has windows overlooking into the room. And Julian's
Mm.
back of the line. First day, he ends up in the room with Pattabhi Jois alone because everyone finishes their practice. So it's just Julian and Pattabhi Jois. So I'm now telling his story. I wasn't there, but I got and like I said, Julian is tight. So he gets to half lotus and seated, cannot do it. And he's kind of like, he's going to tell me to stop any minute. Nope. Keeps going. Basically gets halfway through the series, which is way past where his body can physically do it. And Pattabhi Jois comes up to him in a posture called Supta Kurmasana, puts his hands on his sacrums. It's a really hard pose. It's basically
Yeah.
tortoise, your legs are behind your head. Julian could not do that. And he says, you go close now. That was that. Sharath comes back a week later and basically stops Julian much earlier in the series and literally sits down on his mat. And I was lucky to witness this day in and day out. Sharath would sit there with Julian trying to help him into half lotus. He was tight.
Mm.
Sharath would be like, no biking, no hiking, don't do anything. But Julian eventually was named, I think, on trip to Mr. Marichasana D, which is the name of a challenging hip opening posture, which has a twist as well. And Sharath literally would he was 100% present for him in that room. Even when we moved into the bigger shala with 50 people, he'd be like, Julian, every day I get you in this pose, call me over, or wait, no, wait for me. And Julian would wait like 20 minutes. It was a big shala. There was like 50 people. So he'd do a vinyasa, go back. He was doing Baddha Konasana at the time with your feet like this. And he was, his knees were pointing to the ceiling. So I just have to say that is the real Mysore approach, where the teacher is with you, sees you, meets you as an individual. And
Mm.
that's what Ashtanga is. It's not a lead class where you're sweating your brain. It might be a lead class, but that's not how you learn. You learn from the one-on-one. You learn with the teacher, like Sharath, patiently, sometimes for like 15 minutes, just sitting with Julian. And to this day, Julian can sit comfortably on the floor, which was like a huge,
Wow.
and he doesn't have back pain. When he before yoga, he could hardly get his legs up the wall if he was lying on the floor. So yeah, that is what Mysore is about.
Mm. That is wonderful. All right. So just so folks out there, because I feel like it's important to understand just the depth of commitment that goes into becoming an Ashtanga teacher. Like we have, it's not, you don't go to a 200-hour training and becoming Ashtanga teacher. Like, so what's the process of getting certified to be able to teach this like?
Yeah, there, I think as an Ashtanga teacher, you're basically training for life. You're always working to be a teacher, and the journey really never ends. In Ashtanga, they say that the practice is a teacher, and the practice is for sure the teacher. It's that day in, day out, showing up on the mat that allows you to have the confidence then to share it with others. Um, so that's the first component. For many years, there were not teacher trainings. The first one was in 2009, the one I went to, and then I think there was a few more later. But really, it's about going back to India, going home, doing your practice, going back to India, going home, doing your practice. And it's a constant return to the source and just a constant studying. Um, you're never a master. And this, in a way, is good. And I think allows you to really cultivate devotion and dedication and gratitude because we're really always beginners. Yeah, it's all about showing up and keep showing up and keep showing up. Yeah.
Mm. So let's see. I think we've done a good job of covering things, giving people an idea of what Ashtanga is and what it isn't.
Yeah.
How Ashtanga has like just been such an influence in terms of what we now think of as yoga. So if you're going to your power or your flow class, that has elements of Ashtanga in it. The people who those teachers studied with, their teachers were probably Ashtangis to start off with, and then it kind of trickles down and people create derivations of styles.
Yeah.
How everybody can practice Ashtanga, which is super important, how we get trained.
Yeah.
So, Fiona, let me ask you this. Just a couple more questions. So, what does your own practice look like these days?
Yeah, that's a great practice, we show up. And that's what I love about this practice is all you have, not all you have to do. You just have to show up and listen. And as I said, Ashtanga is a set series. So when I show up, a lot of times I'll go through the primary or maybe part of the second, depending on how I feel lately. Um, it's a constantly evolving practice. Showing up in my 50s is different than showing up in my 20s. In my 30s, I had lots of energy. And pretty much when I was done with my practice, I didn't have, I had a job, but I was teaching yoga, but I didn't have a lot of responsibilities. So there's certain phases in our life where we can show up and we have so much energy and we can put 2000% into it. And when I was going to India in those eras, like he was strict with me. He was meeting my intensity with intensity. It was good. It was forcing me to learn dedication and learn that whole idea of showing up with commitment and dedication. And I'll never forget when I showed up with my two kids, 10 months and two, to India. Um, I was just so relieved to practice. I kind of was past the posture accumulation phase in my life. In my 20s, 30s, it was all about, okay, I need a new pose. I've got to finish second so I can tie it up with a bow, and then I want to go home and get pregnant. Like I had a whole plan. As soon as I had kids, the plan was like, whatever. And I had to laugh because that was the trip. I was probably the weakest physically I had been, the strongest probably because I was a mom of two kids in India with a 10-month-old and a 2-year-old. So I had to be really strong internally. Um, and I remember there's a challenging pose which requires a lot of core in the second series called Karandavasana. And I'd lower and I'd be in the pose, and they would practically come running. It was Saraswati who was teaching, Pattabhi Jois. He wasn't running, but Sharath was running. They'd practically run over to me. And they wouldn't even let me hold it. You're supposed to hold it for 5, but they'd practically run over and help me out of the pose. And I remember that was the one trip Sharad actually gave me a compliment. He said, not bad for a new mom, which for me, like coming from the really intense years, I was like, oh, okay. And, I was just given a lot of love. Not that I was given love before, but I was given a lot of space to be a mom and a practitioner. And I remember one morning the kids wouldn't let me show up wouldn't let me go to the studio. So I showed up like 2 hours late. Of course, they're still teaching. And they just smiled and they said, oh, come on in. So it was really lovely. Then when
Mm,
like mid 40s, when my hormones started changing, my practice had to change also. Suddenly I had less energy. Um, so I had to do more softer days of practice. Um, Sometimes engaging Mula Bandha didn't feel good, even though I wasn't like getting my period or anything like that, but it just
mm,
felt not right. So I had to do different kinds of more mellow, soften my practice. And then into my 50s, into menopause, hormones changing. It's all over the place. It's like some days I
mm,
feel like the strongest person on the planet, and my practice is, and other days it's less so. What I love about Ashtanga is all you have to do is show up. Some days you have more energy, your practice is longer. Some days you have less energy, your practice is shorter. But show up, and I should also say you have to show up and listen. So
mm,
my practice is showing up and listening, and every day it's a little bit different. In my 20s, it looked very similar more of the time. Now
mm,
it's a little bit more. Some days I do less, some days I do more.
mm.
I always show
That's
up,
great.
always try to listen, and of course, breathe. I've plunged,
So
yeah.
yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the future of Ashtanga. So the community's had some challenging times. There were allegations of sexual misconduct levied against Pattabhi Jois, and then Sharath, like this untimely early death. It was just shocking that he passed away. So what next for the Ashtanga community, do you think? Where's
Yeah, I
Ashtanga
mean,
going?
yeah. It's been a rough few months in the Ashtanga world for sure. Yeah, Sharath was 53 when he passed. It was one of those things because I hadn't seen him for a long time, and this trip came up to do this training with him in Virginia in November. And I said to my husband, "This is perfect. My nest is empty. The kids are gone. My daughter just graduated last spring. I'm like, I'm going to Virginia. This is excellent." And we had two mornings with, 2 days with him, two classes with him, and then he tragically passed away. It gets sad. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, there was no way to make any sense of it. It was absolutely unthinkable, horrific, so sad, so tragic. I think the only thing I could do in that time, and even now, I'm like, what would Sharat want?
Hmm.
You take practice. And that's literally what we did. The day after he passed, well, we met and chanted, and the day after that, we chanted, and then we did what Ashtangis do. We practiced. Because practice is, it's our gift to ourselves. It's the one thing that helps us tap into that inner stillness, just like in 9/11 when we were all practicing that day. And I thought, why are we here? And then at the end, I'm like, oh, this is what we need. So that's really the only thing, I've been able to say is this is a really strong lineage. It's been passed down and passed down and passed down. And, you know, the teacher is in the practice. So what would Sharat want us to do? He would want us to show up and take practice. Um,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's still I mean, it's still fresh. It's, he's 53. He was 53.
53.
And that's
I
my
can't.
I'm 53. So,
Yeah.
and yeah, so we practice. And I think as teachers, it's our job to continue to share this as we've been taught and pass on this great lineage. And there's some amazing teachers out there. And they're all teaching and showing up, taking practice, inhale, exhale. So that's what we
Mm.
do. The first few weeks when I was alone, practicing, because I went from Virginia to my parents, I would put on chanting music, which I don't usually do, but I just kept every day I just practiced. I don't even think I took rest days. I just needed to get on my mat, even if they were short or long or it didn't matter, but I just practice.
Mm.
So this is a strong lineage. It's a really strong community. In fact, one of my students just left. Two of my students just left. And they're in Mysore right now in the shala practicing.
Hmm.
So it's still happening. And
Who's leading now?
um I think that maybe some senior teachers who are there will be helping, assisting.
Hmm.
I think that's what I'm hearing. But the seeds have been planted. It's our turn to now, as teachers, as practitioners, to step up. And, you know, so I'll find out more. I don't know. They just got there. They're starting in February, but I'll find out more. But
Well, this is how it is, right? I mean, all the teachers leave and they pass it on and they pass it on, and it's too soon,
it was
right? Sure, it's too
I think
soon,
we're
but
all expecting, I was so excited to see him as I haven't been to Mysore and,
yeah.
raising kids. So, but, I'll share one other story. This also helped me, this story. When I went back to India that time with my two kids when they were little, I was doing a posture in the lead second class. Pattabhi Jois was teaching it with Sharath. And I was doing this posture Kapotasana, which is where you're on your knees and you reach,
Oh,
you take your heels. This was not the hardest posture for me. I had harder postures that invoked a lot of fear, as I mentioned before. This was one of those poses that never was too challenging for me back then. It's a lot harder now. But anyways, I was catching my heels, and in the lead class, it's a hard pose. It's a hard pose. No one wants to hold it for more than 5 breaths. And Pattabhi Jois came up to me and he was pushing on my rib cage and he kept saying, touch your head to the floor. And after having two babies, my hip flexors were so tight and my head was just not going to the floor. And it didn't happen that day. And he eventually moved us on, and no big deal. I've actually never been adjusted in that pose before in any of my trips. And I was kind of doing the pose in that I was catching my heels, but he could definitely see that something was different, even though I was kind of like doing it, but there was something energetically not
mm,
happening, and I could feel it. Fast forward a few years later, I'm back in Vancouver practicing in my shala. Pattabhi Jois has passed away at this point, and I'm doing the pose, and his voice pops into my head, touch your head, and I grab my heels and I touch my head for the first time ever in my life, I think. And I just felt that wheel. And I was like, oh, there it is. It's taken a few years for that seed to ripen. I don't know how many years it was. My kids were older. My body was probably not a fresh, with fresh kids. But
mm.
it was a nice reminder that the teaching is there and the seeds have been planted and they will continue to ripen. And even though they're not here, they're still teaching us.
Mm.
That's been one thing that helped me when Pattabhi Jois died, and I tried to remind myself that with Sharath. Like there's been a lot of teachings, and now is the time to do your practice and you know let them flow. But there are amazing teachers out there, so Ashtanga will continue is continuing. If you're interested in starting it, just find a good teacher.
Yeah, it's a very special practice, and I want to encourage everyone out there. If your curiosity is piqued, if you're like, "What is this?" I mean, I encourage all teachers to go and do Mysore for a while because it's so instructive to what the practice is, and it teaches us so much. So, if somebody did want to go find an Ashtanga teacher, I suppose, would you have suggestions for how they look for someone that they can trust?
Yeah. I mean, there is a website. There's the Sharath Jois website where you can go on and see all the authorized and certified teachers in the world. That's a great starting point. Um, if there's not one in your area, you could always reach out to a teacher that's authorized or certified nearby and say, hey, I live here. Do you have any recommendations? Or just, Google and see who's teaching it. I will say, remember that Ashtanga is traditionally taught one-on-one. So go for a Mysore style or like a beginner. If there's no Mysore style, go for a beginner learning experience because it's not great to be thrown into a lead class. It's not really, it's just not the way it's taught best. And I think sometimes, yeah, I think it can be really challenging, but if you can get a one-on-one experience, that's great.
Yeah, that's great advice because people have ideas about what Ashtanga is, but when it's taught, when you're in the tradition of how it should be taught, then it's a completely different thing.
Yeah, like
Complete-
I can modify
Yeah.
anything. If someone's got a cast, I think even my son came to class once with a cast on, and he obviously couldn't do a lot of things. I think it was from ski racing or something, but we modified. I forgot about that. But yeah,
Yeah.
modify. I can make it work. If someone can't sit, whatever, we'll figure it, or can't stand, we'll figure it out. We'll make it
Yeah.
work.
I
And
remember when I was there, you were teaching someone who had broken their leg. It
yeah, I've
was
had
like,
that many times now. We've had different, and the best thing is I learned from these practitioners too, because I'll be like, that's a good way of doing it. Because they're also, if they
yeah.
already have a yoga practice, they break their leg. And if they really just open up, they create their own postures that they can do, given the limitation of a cast. But because they've had their own self-practice for so long, or, they kind of know how to work with it. And I actually learned from watching them too. It's amazing.
Oh, yeah.
So
So
great.
how can people find you, Fiona? Like, or I mean, I know you're not everybody lives in Vancouver, but where are you?
I'm in Vancouver. We have morning classes. We teach Monday through Fridays, and I teach Mysore Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays in Vancouver, 5:30 in the morning our time till like 8:15. And yeah, there's also online option, which that was a whole new, when COVID hit, we were actually closed for seven months, I think, the physical studio in and out of the course of that period. And it was funny. Someone's like, you're going to have to go on Zoom. And for any of the people who know me, I am not very tech savvy at all. And I'm like, what do you mean we're going on Zoom? I'm like, so the first, sure enough, we went on Zoom within a week. And so I made my husband, Julian, I'm like, you have to stand there and you have to do the entire practice because I can't possibly teach a screen when I'm not in the room with the people. So I made him do the whole primary series next to me. I was like a nervous Nelly, speaking of nervous, but what that opened me up to is I was like, wait a minute, all these people who don't have communities can join online. And we've got this online community of people that show up in the morning from all over. We've got Boston, we've got Vancouver Island, Penticton, the Yukon, Calgary, outside of Calgary, all over. Anyways, and these women show up. They're all women as it is, but men are of course invited too, so that they can be part of a community. And that's an option too. And because Ashtanga is traditionally taught one-on-one, I have a video course that people can start and learn the very foundations so that when they show up online or in studio, they've been taught the breath, they've been taught Surya Namaskara and a few of the standing poses so that they have a basis. And then from there, I just keep adding to it. And with the online people, I will make them videos, or I'll be like, watch this video and we're going to do this pose together tomorrow. Since I can't, Ashtanga is very hands-on. So normally the teacher's helping you in and out of the pose, but I can't do that on a screen. But what I can do is provide a video, a tutorial, they watch it, and then the next day we do it together. So that's kind of how I
Oh,
adapted. And it was funny,
yeah.
after COVID, my online students are like, are you gonna, what are you gonna do? I'm like, well, you're coming. So of course we're doing online. So yeah, we have online.
Oh,
They're a great group, women from Fernie, oh, all over, like really good group of people. So
oh, that's
they,
amazing.
yeah,
I will say that's something that is great about, I mean, as terrible as COVID was and as challenging as it was, one of the great benefits is that teachers who wouldn't necessarily even dream of teaching online now are able to assist and develop communities with people from all over the world. And that's amazing that you're able to do that. Yeah.
that's, I never thought you could teach yoga online. I thought it was crazy, but
Yeah.
it's so great that people now have yoga. The more yoga, the better, as far as I'm concerned. So.
Absolutely. And what is the website where people can find you?
My studio is ashtangayogavancouver.com. So that's me. But yeah, reach out if you have questions, or even if you can't find a teacher, reach out to me. I'll ask around. I'll find you someone. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Fiona, thank you so much. I'm so grateful that you were willing to come and share your time and your knowledge and your experience. It's been so enlightening to hear and so fun for me to hear all of these stories too. So thank you so much. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Oh, goodness. Thank you so much. It was great to see you too. It's been a while.